Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Stephen Oliver, the composer, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, physician and writer, and Nicholas Tucker, lecturer in psychology at Sussex University. Music we have from Instant Sunshine. We were struggling last week to say what the word bounder meant, but the definitive explanation has just arrived from Mr. Geoffrey Martin, who is keeper of public records. Surely, he says, a bounder is one who breaks bounds, who is out of bounds, who exceeds the limits. And as soon as you hear the words, you know he's got it right. Well, as I looked at Mr. Martin's letterhead, where it said Keeper of Public Records, I realised that it is he who is bound by the mysteries of his office to preserve forever the fact, put beyond all doubt during the week, that everyone in England has 16 pairs of underpants. I thought vaguely the results of what are always importantly called surveys were used as linings for pudding bowls, a continuous supply being ensured by armies of women in Macintoshes, stopping people in the street and asking them stupid questions that no real live human being has ever asked any other. But Mr. Martin's note reminded me that as soon as it's been established that a man under 5'8" takes a minute and a half longer to eat a plate of cow heel in Grimsby than he does in Rawtenstall, the information is ferried to Chancery Lane in handcarts, where Mr. Martin, chosen for his endless patience and kindly smile, beams over his pince-nez as he shows them to the shelf where they will gather dust till the crack of doom. But what I want to do is to get the head of the subject into the wind of my real complaint, which is that what makes surveys unreadable is A, they never tell you anything you couldn't have guessed, and B, they make the human race sound preoccupied by what they are not preoccupied by, in forcing them to answer questions about their underpants. Whoever in real life raised their own or anyone else's underpants is a topic of conversation. Surely whatever the women with the clipboards find out about underpants is as nothing compared with the way the question obliges the respondent in replying to it to sound as though he were interested. When the first Martians leaf through Mr. Martin's lumber room, what bores they'll think we were.
It's quite a good definition of a bounder, isn't it? A man who knows how many suits he's got. I'm surprised Mr. Martin didn't tell us. I mean, what intrigued me was that people who know how many pairs of socks they've got. All I know about my socks is I got more single socks than pairs, and it would have been socially useful for these interviewers to bring us single sock holders together.
What do we now do? I mean, I have never thought of myself as a man with underpants at all until I read this. Yes. Until I read this survey and discovered that most people have 18 underpants. So I took a great step. I went to a drawer and opened it. I have thousands of the things. I've never seen so many. They're clearly like wire coat hangers. A man may possess them wholly unconsciously. Well, what now happens? Do I now go forward into the world slightly shyly, say, well, yes, underpants, yes, I've read about them in books, but never, of course, seen a pair? Or do I actually go stride ahead as a grotesquely over-underpanted man?
No, I don't think it does us any harm every now and again to compare ourselves numerically with other people in that way. I mean,
It doesn't do us any harm. Puts the rest of us to sleep, though.
Well, no. There's certain. See, I think you're cheating when you just choose socks and underpants.
All right, dogs. Where the dog sleeps, or does the dog wear the 16 pairs of underpants?
No, you see, I'd have thought if somebody found out they hadn't had a holiday for 5 years and everybody else having 3 holidays a year, but we were so good at seeing the world in our own image. Every now and again, a little nudge about what other people are doing might cause you to review your life, i.e. buy a few more underpants. My only objection to this is that numbers can take us only a little bit of the way, that knowing that people have cats is nothing as compared to knowing how they actually feel about those cats, and that's something that market research...
This is a hideously temperate point of view.
No, look, I absolutely agree with Nicholas. I would definitely make a case for all this. A survey has shown that the British are very keen on surveys. The effect of a lot of trivial information, and the more trivial the better, is that it's like like one of those speeded-up films of people in Oxford Street rushing in and out of shops and scratching themselves and standing at bus stops. Because when you see all this, suddenly all those inconsequential everyday actions form a cogent and informative pattern. And also the whole point of a survey is to compare it with another survey. Now, may I draw your attention to the fact that this year is the 900th anniversary of the Doomsday Book. And for reasons too tedious to go into now, I've recently been doing some research on local entries about my village in the Doomsday Book. Now, they were of stupefying tedium. You know, it was sort of 2 ploughs and 1 vergate under Odo and Ediva. It was this kind of thing. But all of a sudden, it's interesting to see that where those people lived then, now we have a couple suffering from executive stress with a 2-stroke lawnmower and a Merc in the garage.
That is not interesting.
I find it interesting. I think it is.
It's the first term in the equation, Sarah, that's interesting. I mean, because it's part of a historical research, and it's lovely and romantic to feel that you're sitting or living on the same spot as all this happened. But once you start trying to refer it to what's going on now, I think it becomes dull.
I think you're quite right to hone in on the fact that these things give us permission to be bores, and that's why we really like them. They are the lay equivalent of being permitted to enter a pulpit and deliver a sermon. They're things we've always wanted to do. I love them. I'm a glutton for them. I have devised whole fantasy lives for these girls of complete and absolute inaccuracy, including one girl who asked me where I slept. So I said firmly, in an upright chair with Brahms quartets playing through
I think you've actually given the answer to Nicholas as even, because I worry about the quality of the data as well. I mean, some of the surveys this week were to do with who are the heroes and heroines now. And I think when people are stopped in the street by an attractive woman, they're quite likely to give answers that will flatter themselves, and panel game answers. Do you remember there was a programme called... that Wilfred Pickles called Have a Go, wasn't that it? And I remember Eric, the produced these panel game answers, the common answer that was good to give. And Eric Barker, a comedian, did a marvellous pastiche of it when he sort of interviewed, and how old are you? And 84, and everyone burst into applause. And are you crippled? No, said the man. Pity, said Eric Barker. And then he said, and now you're 84. Have you got a message for the rest of us? And the man said, yes. I'd like everyone to go around smiling, and I'd like everyone to have a bicycle. And this is vision of people going around smiling on bicycles is the data we're being given by these answers.
It's interesting stuff that doesn't get into surveys. What I'd really like to have known, not where dogs sleep or don't sleep, but whether dogs actually live in dog kennels. Now, I've often thought, I thought they might have touched on it, but you bet they didn't. How, if you have a dog kennel, if they exist, do you entice the dog into it? Do you push him in with one of those big plungers you clear the bath with? Or how do you get him in? Or is it simply... Is the dog kennel, or Wendy House for dogs, a feature only of mythology? The sort of, I think, really and truly, it was invented by the film fun strip artists. Yeah. But you'll all hold your hands up and say, well, I've got a dog kennel.
I think I can answer why you don't get that sort of information. Because I've actually, when I was a student, had to give these surveys as well as taking place in them. The point really is that you can get the boring information easily, but the more personal stuff is impossible to get. And I'm very glad. Because, for example, I was reading this week that some surveys now disclose that most married couples make love twice a week, half an hour on Wednesdays or something, and 40 minutes in the weekends.
What allows you to suppose that anyone told the truth?
I don't care if they have or they haven't. The point is, this sort of information is much too delicate to get out into the public. Everybody reading it immediately makes a mental comparison between them and this mythical couple. They have to bump up their own performance if they're underneath. So long live market research. As long as they're boring.
Only in one way, so long as Mr. Martin down in Chancery Lane continues to receive all this stuff, you know, all about thermal underwear in Collier's Wood. Think what would be unloaded over dinner tables if kindly Mr. Martin didn't take it in, come in, he says he gets it. We owe him a great debt. We pass on to something contingent. I wonder if you've noticed how Poppy Day gets earlier. It's been going on for a couple of weeks now, really. And some of the ladies who sell them in the street, sell the poppies in the street, aren't as ingratiating as the ladies who want to know about your underpants. One stepped forward in a small town in Devon and said threateningly, "Good morning." And I was caught unawares. I said good morning back and went my way. But I realised too late her good morning was a form of importuning. And I rather feebly bought a poppy on the, or whatever it was she was selling, it was a flag, I think, on the way back from getting a paper. And I thought, ungraciously, she knew she could bully everyone, because who would dare resist? And my friend was challenged by a lady on Victoria Station. He was returning to East Molesey, as he often does. And this lady said, "You haven't got one." And he replied, and he admits it's not the wittiest thing he ever said, "No, I haven't." And he says every time he thinks of himself saying the words, he goes red with shame and gets toothache. I don't say every seller of flags and poppies goes in for this mild form of public pillorying. And anyway, perhaps if they didn't, some of us wouldn't shell out. But is it okay, do you think?
It's not so much
A round of
impoliteness that's the problem, is it? You don't mind giving to people who are in some way interesting. When General Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, was accused by one of the converts of being too vulgar and melodramatic with his bands and his waving flags and everything, he said, "Young man, if I thought I could get a soul to the Lord by learning to play the tambourine with my toes, I should learn to do it."
Yes,
and
yes.
that's certainly true. One naturally gives to interesting people. We often go round for a drink after this little episode to a pub round the corner. There's generally a Salvationist there selling their
She stands
whatever.
4'3". She wears the poke, and the only time you know she's there because her poke bonnet is sort of banging into your sternum. That's right.
We could not fail to get, because she is intriguing. She is a cheerful, brave, elderly woman, and no one would not give to such a
But
person.
you see, but we do. I've noticed that we do tend to give, and we're not alone in doing this. It's a public house and drink has been taken, and everyone gives with a flourish, as though they were a cross between Errol Flynn and Mother Teresa. I think one has to just take that into account.
Right.
But she's a wonderful old girl.
Oh, I think she's a very special case. But I would have given to this lady on Victoria Station, I think, because I once had to collect money for Men Cap in Oxford Street, and I had my tin, and I found it terribly embarrassing. So my technique was, on the whole, to avoid everybody's eyes. They came up to me, and I collected almost nothing. Halfway through the operation, the organizer came on and said, "That's no good." She said, "Get out there, smile at people, shake your tin, don't let them go past." So, as I had some obligation, I did all this, and I collected tremendous lots of money for people to say, "You won too," and all sorts of things like that. So what I do now is that I honour the people who are doing their job properly. If somebody's actually collecting and making me pay up and doing all these things, working at it, then I think the workman is worthy of his hire. He gets
I
their money.
think-
I must say,
Champion
I
for
think
that.
you're in a minority. I have sold flags many a time and oft, and it's my experience that the great British public loathes to feel that they're being sold something. The best demeanour for a flag seller is to march up and down, avoiding all eye contact, because that is very embarrassing.
don't
That is
say
to invite
anything.
aggression and argument. You should jangle your tin, avoid eye contact, and take 3 paces to the right and 3 paces to the left, so that the potential giver comes to you, that they must accost you and say, "Stop, old chap,
Yeah,
I agree
true.
with this for the Cats' Homes, and I will give you £1. But there are 1 or 2 tips should you ever do this again. The child is an important way in. A benign but neutral look at the child, and then the child will say, "We want to put a coin in this tin, Mum." Keep looking at the child, don't look at the adult. In the end, along will come the child towing the adult in its wake.
Timing is important too, because
Oh, yes.
I got data on this, not exactly flags, but collection plates, which seem to produce the same reactions. And I remember when I was a boy, a priest in Doncaster called Father Holwright, he said he was quite sure that if he sent the plate round before he preached, he did better than if he sent it round after. This must be the equivalent of keeping your eye on the child. And hospitals know that if they want to collect money, you never send the consultants' wives out with the tins, you send out the nurses.
It's terribly difficult to resist causes that are clearly unanswerably good, but unanswerably good causes are just as unanswerable as tyrants, as Heliogabalus. It's very difficult to avoid feeling irritated, because no one would at all argue with giving food to the poor. It's not a thing you could possibly discuss.
Yes, but
and so it's very
but
natural
Stephen-
to want to avoid the banality of that confrontation.
Yes,
Yeah,
but the
yeah.
argument to
said,
this, and
Alexander.
beautifully you said it, is that many a person has come up to me and to other people when saying, I poke them in the chest, when I thought I'd really put my sales pitch on, and sort of said, "You'd be better employed back at home looking at your elderly neighbour and taking her up the shops instead of standing there jangling that tin."
But
at
it
you."
is irresistible. Just to carry further with the tyranny of everything being good and intact. I mean, there are all sorts of performers who do good deeds, and therefore you can't criticise their performances. And I can't mention the 2 names involved here, but one is a very distinguished film critic, a lady, and another is a lady too, who's by no means an undistinguished performer on these airwaves and such. And I think they once had to do something together, more than once. And the second time, the lady film critic said, because she's getting on a little now. She said, if that woman tries to help me out of the car and across the pavement again, I'll punch her in the nose. And it was the tyranny. You couldn't assail the other woman because she did good work.
Let me come back on this.
Before.
This tyranny. I simply don't agree at all. I mean, the idea that people walking along the pavement with pocketfuls of money, that we should somehow feel sorry for them, that they're tyrannised over.
No, they are the tyrants. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
no, you're
going back to the person with the tin, it seems to me...
The person with the tin is the tyrant.
Yes, but see, I don't think so at all. I've been the person with the tin, Sarah has, and it's a rather invidious position. And what happens is you damn well know that no one wants to give any particular money, and it becomes a game of skill. Can you catch their eye? Can they avoid you? If they can't, they give this rueful smile, always a rueful smile. It's a fair cop, and they put their hand in their pocket and produce 10p. It seems to me part of the quite sort of pleasant little domestic dramas of a Saturday morning. To make a big meal of it, talk about tyrants, is simply absurd.
Well, I mean, I would support Stephen in that I went for a walk this afternoon and I saw a bit of local graffiti, and on a wall it says, "Kick Bobbed Geldorf for Christmas." I thought, and I could understand the spirit behind it. The tin holder, I think the gradations of personality in the tin holder are important. I mean, there are minor gradations of personality that make a difference. It's the difference between Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, I think, that make... both are there eager. Somehow Astaire had something that didn't make him a tyrant. I think Gene Kelly was a bit tyrannical in some of his dancing.
Yes.
And also, of course, you're not actually being sold anything. You are giving. You are being begged to, and you are giving, and this is the emblem of your niceness. So the thing is, if they can persuade you that you actually are buying something a little bit more, so much the better. For instance, if there's a bit of music, we have some people who import this huge barrel organ into our high street, and they stand round it jangling their tins and looking affable, and the vague sensation that you're buying this little slice of happiness makes people give more freely, because you're not actually buying at all, you're getting a badge for being a nice person.
Slice of happiness we're going to have now. Bit of music, exactly. You might have been offering me some sort of a cue there. The lads are going to sing Court Brief, and you will find all we have up to now said set to music.
Now, could you tell the court, in your own words, just how you come to find yourself in this invidious position?
I was walking in the high street one bleak day when a fellow with a clipboard blocked my way, and with a strange compulsive stare quizzed me from his questionnaire on soapflakes, medicine and the law, computer sciences and more. And yet one question stood alone. He asked how many underpants I own. This survey, so the fellow told me, feeds our government with all the facts it needs to set out plans for years ahead. This question spun around my head. The nation's future may rely upon my accurate reply. It's vital that the fact be known how many pairs of underpants I own.
And then my lord, my client fled, his stomach gripped with sickening dread. Until that day, he had no care to count up pairs of underwear. But now it seemed this crucial fact determined how our leaders act. One pair, less or more, could lead to war.
In search of pants, I turned out every drawer to document each Y front that I wore. But soon my apprehension grew. Had I too many or too few? What is the national average score? Should I have less? Should I have more? No previous research had shown how many pairs of pants a man should own.
He ran to several well-known stores and asked on all the menswear floors how many underpants were sold, and prayed some pattern would unfold. He searched for weeks on end in vain, and colleagues labelled him insane. The man who raves and rants about underpants.
That fellow with the clipboard wrecked my life. My mad obsession drove away my wife. Now I'm terrified to meet or talk to people in the street. And if I take a lonely stroll and I'm approached, I lose control. And that, your worship, tells you why I poked this poppy seller in the eye. I'm sorry, my lad, I just couldn't help it. I don't know what came over me. I'm sorry.
I rest my case.
Well, there they were singing, and they did it awfully well too, didn't they? And yes, it perhaps leads on to our third topic. A friend of mine leant forward and boomed, "But my dear fellow, you don't know how famous I am." And I replied, "I do know how famous you are." And afterwards, I thought this was an almost pure example of irony. I don't say it entertains. All I'm saying is it's a pure example of irony. Irony being a mode in which the voice of one is heard in the voice of another to its disadvantage. Neither voice, of course, must be distorted. When they are, it is not irony, it is sarcasm. I was well pleased with this little bit of analysis, slightly doubting whether it had ever been put quite so deftly before, only to find that, yes, it had, quite often, and the best of the various definitions are included in, but above all incorporated by, D.J. Enright's essay on irony, which he calls The Alluring Problem. Anyone who enjoys a bit of a brood on style and meaning, especially when it's witty as well as thoughtful, should flock along in great numbers and buy it. It's just out and it's published by the OUP. But I thought as a topic it might well suit us here because a lot of irony, of a fairly crude, unwinnowed sort, gets deployed in the course of these conversations, doesn't it?
It's interesting what you say about the two voices, Bob, because I think that's absolutely central to my to opera. Opera is, when you think about it, an art wholly devoted to irony. The irony being that all the characters in opera do more or less unpleasant things: marry their mothers, murder their fathers, poison each other, fall in love with the wrong soprano. But they do this all subsumed under the discourse of the most beautiful and extraordinary way of communicating known to man, that is, of music. And the irony is, the more beautiful the music, the more horrible, usually, the devastation that the characters create.
I'm surprised, Bob, that...
No, you're not.
For the purposes of this program.
I genuinely am surprised that you insist on this human voice in your definition.
How you take it a mite too literally. I might have said style, address,
It doesn't
prejudice,
matter.
ways of going on. I thought voice.
The fundamental irony from which we all grow from is the irony of the universe. It's the irony whereby, as he said in this book, you go into a bookshop and find Alice in Wonderland propped up next to Lolita, or you find a police station is actually based in something called Pig Lane. We begin by noticing the ironies evident in the outside world, and I think that those are fine, that those make life interesting. Where I'm not so happy is when we then get the human ironist coming in and insisting somehow that his measure of things is the true one, and the things that you believe in are really deeply satirical and ambiguous.
Yeah, no, I can't return yet a while because I see the others are striving to answer you.
But this is why he calls it the alluring problem, surely. That's not what he's saying. I mean, I think it's a splendid book. The trouble with it's a bit like an onion. You keep on peeling off layers of meaning, and your eyes start running, partly out of sadness and sometimes with laughter. And in the end, I decided I would settle for the good doctor's definition of his list of definitions at the beginning, which was a mode of speech where the meaning contradicts the words actually used. That's not what the doctor says, but that's how I interpret it. And I think that's why when Enright describes it as alluring, that is what it is, really. And an awful lot of stringing together of words in a voice, as our chairman calls it, but in a style, is rather boring. And what stubs our eye occasionally is the intentional ironic use, as long as it isn't over-laboured, as he said, as long as it doesn't show the sweat.
I must admit, I did struggle. It's one of those words with the word itself sounds hard and precise, but of course actually trying to crystallise your ideas is not just like gathering mist, but rather like trying to sort of push blancmange into a pencil sharpener. But it's a kind of world-weary mode, a know-it-all mode, which is why people who have an ironic manner are often intensely disliked.
There's an element of truth in there.
One's first one of my first appreciations of irony was sort of at school and in school reports and in the way that teachers teach children. I feel there's a big ironic level in all that. You know, you, Braithwaite Major, if we could possibly tear you away from drawing a moustache on the Playboy centrefold, we would like you to pay attention to that. Well, I'm not sure.
It distorts both parties. The teacher doesn't talk in the right voice, and he is not imitating Braithwaite Minor's true voice. By voice, I have to repeat, I mean style.
But Sarah, surely you shouldn't be too absolute in this. The world...
How can you be less than too absolute?
No, listen.
Thank you. That's just the sort of remark we relish on.
A deeply ironic
well
remark.
Done, sir.
That the world-weary irony is as somebody said in the book, it begins to corrode the hand that holds it. I mean, it's somebody who's always injecting doubt into other people's certainties. I've got no time for that. But on the other hand, he does quote examples where irony is the last defence of the poor man, as it were.
Quite right.
You remember this case of the poor peasant and the king looking over him and realised there's an incredible physical resemblance between him and the peasant who are the same age. So he said, "Was your mother ever at court?" And the poor peasant said, "No, but my father was." Yes. Now, Sarah, this is the last human dignity, isn't it?
Yeah, but
we have the ironic dignity.
But you slide over the therapeutic function of irony, which is indeed to inject this uncertainty. No, not to inject it, but to highlight it, because as Enright very usefully says, uncertainty is of the essence of all condition. There is no certainty, and the ironist, of course, he's a smart aleck from time to time, doesn't say, "I know better," and I'm quoting Enright again. He says, "I know otherwise," and thus, of course, casts doubt on where doubt lives. You see, he doesn't import the doubt. Doubt lives there.
I think that's terribly well said. I think you've got to... I hate to have to admit this.
Is that an ironic remark or a sarcastic remark?
No, I mean, you've got to, though, I mean, in a dialogue between Byron and Wordsworth, one being an ironist and one not at all, you have to, in the end, I think Nicholas is right, come down on the side of Wordsworth, even if he does, write lines like, "I measured it from side to side, it's 3 feet long and 2 feet wide." I mean, that's fine, but it's better to have written like Wordsworth than like Byron. I will freely admit that. At the same time...
We mustn't bandy compliments, but that's terribly well said. It absolutely is, because the other one comes first, the absolute direct statement, and irony allows most of us to avoid realising that we aren't Wordsworth.
It's love without commitment. It's John Betjeman. That's what irony is. It's liking and being amused by. Now, that is, I agree with Nicholas in some ways, that is vicious when it's applied to things which aren't perhaps terribly important. When it's in the face of oppression and all but super power, it seems to me admirable. I'd like to, though, take up Michael's brilliant analogy to the onion. In Peer Gynt, Peer takes up an onion and peels it and finds there is no centre and says, "Nature is witty."
We must be very clear, must we not, Stephen, that in Byron being Byron and Wordsworth being Wordsworth, Byron cannot, does not, and will not impugn Wordsworth.
Well,
Wordsworth
it does. Bob Souther, you're a poet laureate, is all in a huge and savage attack on the lakeside.
Is it successful?
Well, it is. Bob Souther is no longer read.
If Wordsworth is who you say he is, he survives, he lasts. So what Nicholas was saying, that somehow the uncertainty which is pointed to, which is indigenous to all situations in all times, cannot bring down what is certain, what is occasionally certain. And you spoke of it when you referred to
I would claim the universality.
I'm sorry. I better shut up.
I was going to put in another defence of the ironist. As a doctor, I recognise a condition of irony deprivation, which is called gravitas, I think, from which a lot of my contemporaries suffer, who were lively, companionable chaps and chapesses as well, some of them, and suddenly reached an age where irony is a dangerous thing for them to indulge in. And
Do you find it?
Well, maybe because I've been at the General Medical Council this week. I actually apologised at one stage during the meeting.
Irony there,
the meeting, and I said, I apologised to the President, said, "I'm reading a book on irony this week." And they actually understood. So underneath they understood. But I think it's very dangerous to try and banish irony from your life, which people do.
I think it's Sarah's turn.
Thank you so much. It's interesting you say that, because I regard irony as a very sort of grown-up thing, something that people come to. I mean, children have absolutely no sense of irony whatsoever. I must just say that this is a lovely book, and that was my all-time favourite from Hardy's The Ruined Maid, when the so-called ruined maid is talking to her friend, a pink-cheeked country girl who's obviously come to censure her and call her back from her evil ways, but has to comment on how fit, well and smart she's looking on this regime of depravity. Yeah. And the girl says, "True, one's pretty lively when ruined." Great stuff.
There's a much worse story, though. I would say that irony becomes a habit of mind, as it were. We can't really condemn people for it. We've got no right to condemn them for it. What we really should look at is what they do with their lives.
Well,
now, some of the supreme ironists, like Bernard Shaw, George Orwell, John Betjeman, indeed, they were ironic in their mode of life, but they actually went out and did things, and that's the real measure.
Let me add some fuel to the fire that you've set a match to there. I brood myself on whether irony is not the instrument of the non-combatant. Now, Enright here refers to the appalling, the odious Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. You know, you've delighted us long enough, my dear, that sort of thing. And he says he's a henpecked character, and he uses irony as, and I quote Enright here, a self-awarded consolation prize of the defeated. Now, I wonder whether it doesn't just apply to Mr. Bennet, but whether all ironists so much fear defeat that they will never pick up the real sword. They will simply mime a bloodless version of it.
The universality of irony is not to be defeated at all. I think if we could get off mighty poets in their misery dead for a moment and turn to China. Enright in this book says the Chinese
big enough in all conscience
are not ironic. Well, I have a story which defies that view. He mentions one lovely thing of an English nurse in Birmingham looking up a Chinese phrase book dealing with a Chinese patient and finding the only two useful sentences are, I am sorry your concubine is sick, and here comes the executioner. But a friend of mine actually learnt Chinese, and one of the first, after one of his first successes in getting mo, mo, mo right or something, the teacher said, remember, Mr. Cha is fond of dragons. And the story behind this, which perhaps is incomprehensible without this, is that Mr. Cha spent his whole life writing a book about dragons, disproving their existence, discovering the hippopotamus, the rhinoceros, the volcano, all those things which silly men have taken as dragons. And of course, the end of the story is, as he closes the book and pushes his brush down on the last page, a dragon looks through the window and burns him instantly to death.
There's that lovely remark that Sidney Smith made about his brother, the bishop, that he has risen through his gravity and I have been sunk by my levity. And there's an awful lot of that that goes on in pompous professions.
One of the you see, because we all like to use irony here, one of the dreadful things about it is that you can't seem to engage in a combat in which you know your own blood is not going to be spilled. But I just want to say there's a favourite story, I mean, to illustrate the certain fact, I think, that the ironist never rubs it in. I think this is an irony. It's a favourite story of mine, which means I've told it before. And I don't want any groans when you start to remember it. It embodies a pretty irony. The young lobster who wanted to marry a crab and whose mother said, "My dear, they're so common and they don't have any money. And moreover, they walk sideways. You couldn't marry anyone who walked sideways." "Meet him, mother," said the lobster, "meet him." And she turned up the crab, who shook hands politely and walked in a dead straight line into the drawing room. "But I thought crabs always walk sideways," said the mother. "They do," said the crab, gravely accepting her premise, because he was an ironist, "but I'm drunk."
Sarah Harrison, Stephen Oliver, Dr. Michael O'Donnell and Nicholas Tucker were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.